Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Poisoner in Chief. Try to get through the last part of this. In 1952, Gottlieb helped organize a conference at Eaglewood Arsenal on psychochemicals as a new concept of war. Panelists, all of them CIA or Chemical Corps officers, was the highest security clearance, discussed chemical compounds that could induce mass hysteria, and aerosol techniques by which these compounds could be sprayed all over large areas. The speaker was attracted the most attention was I. Wilson Green, whose advocacy of LSD had been a secret. Although almost no one in the room knew of it, he had even heard of the drug. He astonished them by describing what he called the incredible discovery of an ergo enzyme that could cause symptoms ranging from hallucinations to suicidal tendencies, even when used in infinitesimal quantities. When he read from a report by a volunteer who wrote that under the drug's influence, he had seen flickering, glimmering, glittering, scintillating, rapid and slow blotting of colors, sparks, whirling, traveling small dots, light flashes, and sheet lightning. Green ventured a few thoughts about ways that LSD might be used in war, in targeted urban areas that cloud from multiple bombs or generating devices would blanket the densest portion. He said saboteurs or intelligence operative could release psychochemicals from hand-operated generators. Upcoming field projects will focus all along distant cloud travel and the behavior of aerosols when released over populated areas. Before finishing, Green noted the presence of Frank Olson and another aerosol experts. He called this work essential for the development of these weapons and urged others to take advantage of their expertise. One scientist asked him if LSD could be made in research quantities. Not yet, replied Green, but soon. The presentation intrigued but did not satisfy Gottlieb. He was pleased to see that Green still shared his belief on LSD's earth-shattering potential. Still, a crucial difference remained. Green imagined LSD as a battlefield weapon. Gottlieb wanted it to use it as mind control. I was fascinated by the idea Green was advancing, he said later. He was convinced that it was possible to actually win a battle or larger engagement without killing anyone or destroying any property. While I found this a novel approach to war, I was somewhat skeptical about it, but I was intrigued by the potential application of psychochemicals to much smaller situations and conflicts. There I saw a tremendous promise. Until Gottlieb arrived at UCLA or at the CIA, most experiments with mind control drugs was aimed at finding a truth serum. That various drugs were found one by one to be useless as reliable aids to interrogation, and as their possible value of introducing amnesia was also discounted. They were pushed aside. The same might have happened with LSD. Early experiments showed that while some who took it became docile and uninhibited, others had completely different reactions, imagining themselves super powerful and fiercely refusing to cooperate. Some had paranoid breakdowns. Scientists who did artichoke work with LSD, mainly at Villa Schuster in Germany and other secret prisons, were forced to conclude that it was not a reliable truth serum, and it did not wipe away memory. Gottlieb, however, was convinced that LSD had powers yet to be understood. It affected the brain in wildly powerful ways. Because it is colorless, tasteless, and odorless, it seemed ideally suited for clandestine use. And as one CIA psychiatrist put it, the most fascinating thing about it was that such minute quantities had such a terrific effect. Another factor driving Gottlieb to pursue research into LSD was the creeping fear that Soviet scientists must also be on the trail. No evidence ever emerged to suggest that they were, but it seemed a reasonable suspicion. The discovery of LSD had been reported in Russian journals. CIA analysts speculated that Soviet scientists might be stockpiling ergo enzymes as raw material. Although no Soviet data available on LSD-25, they concluded in one assessment, it must be assumed that the scientists of the USSR are thoroughly cognizant of the strategic importance of this powerful new drug and are capable of producing it at any time. Gottlieb's burgeoning ambitions quickly outpaced his resources. He began outsourcing experiments to Camp Dietrich. The officers he deployed were told not to reveal that they were work for the CIA and to identify themselves only as staff support group. Some Army scientists guessed the truth and disapproved. Do you know what a self-contained, off-the-shelf operation means? One of them asked years later. A CIA was running one in my lab, and they were testing psychochemicals and running experiments in my lab, and they weren't telling me. Lab's drug experiments were not confined at Washington and Maryland. He traveled regularly in order to observe and participate in special interrogation sessions at detention centers abroad. On these missions, he had a chance to test his potions on human prisoners. In 1951, a team of CIA scientists led by Dr. Gottlieb flew to Tokyo. According to one study, 4 Japanese suspected of working for the Russians were secretly brought to a location where the CIA doctors injected them with a variety of depressants and stimulants. Under relentless questioning, they confessed to working for the Russians. They were taken out into Tokyo Bay, shot and dumped overboard. The CIA team flew to Seoul in South Korea and repeated the experiment on 25 North Korean prisoners of war. They were asked to denounce communism. They refused and were executed. In 1952, Dulles brought Dr. Gottlieb and his team to post-war Munich in southern Germany. They set up a base in a safe house. Throughout the winter of 52 and 53, scores of expendables were brought to the safe house. They were given massive amounts of drugs, some of which Frank Olson had prepared back at Dietrich to see if their minds could be altered. Others were given electroconvulsive shocks. Each experiment failed. The expendables were killed and their bodies burned. Months of experiments like these left Gottlieb unsatisfied. He decided he needed to formalize his relationship with the Special Operations Division at Camp Dietrich. He became one of the world's most advanced biochemical laboratories. Though few knew this, since all of it was secret, in facilities including the custom-built test chamber known as the 8-Ball were unmatched anywhere. Gottlieb wanted to see these assets to propel Artichoke to new heights. For more than a year, under the terms of M.K. Naomi, the Special Operations Division had been doing research and production work for the CIA. Gottlieb and Dulles to negotiate a formal accord that would allow him to deepen this cooperation. Officially, it would link the Army's Chemical Corps and the CIA, but its real meaning was narrower. It would bind the small secret, super secret units within each organization that did artichoke work. The Special Operations Division at Camp Dietrich, run by an elite band of Army scientists with advanced research capacity, and their handful of CIA counterparts who, under Gottlieb, were planning to take artichoke to wildly new directions. Under an agreement reached with the Army in 1952, Senate investigators wrote years later, the Special Operations Division at Dietrich was to assist the CIA in developing, testing, and manufacturing biological agents and delivery systems. By this agreement, CIA acquired the knowledge, skill, and the facilities of the Army to develop biological weapons suited for CIA use. The secret accord gave Gottlieb new momentum. He had already observed the efforts of various drugs on himself and his colleagues. From there, he had gone on to free drugs in much larger doses and under far more torturous conditions to prisoners and other helpless subjects. That was not enough. He wanted to know more. One of the luxuries of Gottlieb's interrogators enjoyed was the knowledge that if any expendables died from their experiments, disposing of their bodies would be no problem. This was not always a full, efficient process. As an American translator who worked at Camp King discovered while signing herself there one weekend in mid-52, arrived back at Frankfurt from Paris sun. Morning in time to spend all day at the obscure swimming pool, acquiring a nice tan. She wrote in a letter home, they dragged a dead man out of the pool at 10 a.m. Bohemian expatriates in Paris have been drawn to Les Selects since it was opened in 1925. It was one of the city's classic literary cafes. With Art Deco flourishing and large windows overlooking Montparnasse, Henry Miller, Emma Goldwyn, Samuel Beckett, Pablo Pascal, Man Ray, and Louis Brunel were regulars. So was Ernest Hemingway, who wrote The Sun Also Rises, of carefree lovers who hail taxis near the Seine and tell the driver les select. Hart Crane once started a fight at the bar. Isadora Duncan flung the saucer during an argument over the Sacco Vanzetti trial. With this pedigree, Les Select naturally attracted a young American artist who came to Paris in 1951, Stanley Glickman. Stanley Glickman had shown artistic talent from childhood. During his high school years in New York, he took advanced classes and won prizes. After arriving in Paris, he enrolled at the Académie de la Grande Chaumerie, spent the following summer studying fresco paintings in Florence, and then returned to take classes from the modernist master Ferdinand Leger. His studio was near Les Select, but after a while he came to prefer another café, La Dome, just across the boulevard from Du Montparnasse. One evening on October 52, he was drinking coffee there when an acquaintance appeared and invited him over to Les Select. Reluctantly, he agreed. At Les Select, two joined the group of Americans whose conservative dress set them apart from the rest of the crowd. Talk turned to politics and grew heated. Glickman rose to leave, but one of the men insisted on buying him a last drink to show there was no hard feelings. Glickman said he had a glass of chartreuse and herbal liqueur. Rather than call the waiter, the man walked to the bar, ordered the chartreuse himself, and carried it back to the table. He walked with a limp. Glickman later recalled, the next few minutes were the last of Glickman's productive life. After taking a few sips from his drink, he began to feel what he later called a lengthening. This is hard for me to read, okay? I've taken LSD many times. Mr. Green, did he invent the green double domes? I took those too. After a lengthening of distance and distortion of perception, Stanley Glickman, soon he was hallucinating. Others at the table leaned in, fascinated. One told Glickman he could perform miracles. Finally, overwhelmed by panic and fearing that he had been poisoned, he jumped and fled. After awakening the next morning, Glickman was overcome by another wave of hallucinations. Visions overwhelmed his mind. He abandoned his studies and began wandering aimlessly through Montparnasse. One day he walked into Les Select, sat down, and collapsed. An ambulance brought him to the American hospital, which maintained a confidential relationship with the CIA. Records say he was given sedatives, but he later asserted that he was treated with electroshock and possibly given more hallucinogenic drugs. His Canadian girlfriend arrived after a week and signed out of the hospital. He sent her back to Canada, warning her that she would ruin her life if she stayed with him. In the next 10 months, Glickman lived as a recluse in his garret, refusing to eat for fear of poison. Finally, his parents learned of his condition and brought him home. He never recovered. For the rest of his life, he lived in an apartment in Manhattan, East Village, with dogs as his only companions. At a time, he ran a small antique shop. He never again painted, read books, worked steadily, or had a romantic relationship. Even in the area known as Street Characters, according to one chronicle, he cut a striking figure with a shock with white hair and red and black silk scarf, knotted like a cravat. But most of the time, he just sat on his step and with a cup of coffee. If Glickman was the subject of an artichoke experiment, why did Gottlieb choose him rather than someone else? Coincidences of a logical possibility. The acquaintance who lurked Glickman into La Select might simply have noticed him sitting in a cafe across the street and suggested him as conveniently available victim. Later investigation, however, raised another possibility. Several months before his apparent poisoning, Glickman had been treated for hepatitis at the American hospital. Artichoke researchers were interested in learning whether people with hepatitis might be especially vulnerable to LSD. Glickman would have been the ideal subject for a test. A later CIA memo summarizing the results of experiments conducted during the early 1950s includes this conclusion. Subjects to whom even a slight modification of heptic function is present makes a very marked response to LSD. We will leave this chapter now and continue on with the trauma experiments created by the CIA overseas and in America. And we're going to go right into one of Steve's relatives, President Eisenhower. Have a wonderful day and like and subscribe.